Crisis in philosophy. Ruminations. Why do we speak of crisis? Etymologically, crisis, from crino, to separate, suggests a break, a fracture, a rift. There's a normal situation in which all that happens is accepted as, shall we say, natural. The conventional or positive order of things is perceived as acceptable. Then there is a moment of crisis. What does that entail? A fracture from normality. The normal is no longer acceptable. Something is wrong with it. Something is perceived as wrong in the conventional given order of things. This problem emerges on two levels. On the one hand, the normal hierarchy of disciplines is questioned. So we could say that the social structure is questioned. Those who are on top should not be on top, or are not perceived as worthy of being on top. Those who are on the bottom perhaps are perceived as being worthy of being even on top. Then, within every discipline of life, we see what is questionable. Say, a painter. In painting, the best painters are not respected, honored, rewarded. The worst painters are. Now, that would be a perception that suggests crisis. So we have a present condition, a present setup that is no longer generally accepted. It is not perceived as being acceptable. Then we speak of a crisis. Right. Now, what is the source of a crisis? Well, in ancient times, philosophy is perceived as the source of crisis. Philosophers provoke crisis. Socrates was, of course, notoriously accused of corrupting youth. What does this mean? He was a source of corruption. Rome, as we know, Republican Rome, was evidently skeptical of philosophy, of Greek philosophy. Why? Well, Greek philosophy introduced abstractions, a language that appeared to non-philosophers to be cut off from ordinary experience and even common sense. The reasonings of philosophers became disengaged with ordinary ethical life. So we have a break between what we could call metaphysics and ethics. And this invited young people to question the ethical order of things, ethical life, and see it as false, and seek, therefore, truth in a world, an order of things that was independent of ethical considerations and concerns. That's a good reason to point your finger at philosophers. Philosophers were responsible for this sort of crisis. Now, in comes Socrates, however, and he arguably tries to, well, not only address this problem, but point to a remedy. And that remedy comes through philosophy. Now, if in pre-philosophical times we have suspicion against philosophy, precisely because of this danger that philosophy carries within itself, in post-philosophical times, we can have, or in the light of philosophy, we can have resentment against philosophers. And so there is an anger and, in fact, a hatred of philosophy that leads to outright persecution of philosophers. Philosophers are those who disrupt the normal hierarchy of things, the normal setup, the normal order. So, corruption involves here the alienation of words, and so the language of authority, the language that is sensed as authoritative from experience, life of the people. This engenders complexity. We complicate matters, right? Very often in academia, we hear professors speaking of the need to find further complexity in questions and matters and judgment and values and opinions. We need further complexity to better understand problems. We need to complicate the matter. But this complication, of course, leads to confusion. And this confusion carries with it a mismatch, incongruity between, what is merit, worth, and reward. In turn, this leads to a questioning of authority. Now, what happens when the non-philosopher is faced with crisis? Well, he seeks a culprit outside of himself. So he tends to distrust practical, concrete standards of value, and so ends up in one camp or another in a kind of tribal warfare. So the crisis that he finds himself in drives him or serves as a pretext for taking sides. So in the face of an emergency, a crisis, we take side. We go on one camp against another camp. And this seems to be necessary. The urgency of the crisis forces us to go and fight. Now, there is also a heroic response to the crisis. A heroic response could be a tragic one, as we find in ancient Greek tragedies, that appeals to ancestral standards. So the ancestral is the source of right. Now, there is, or must be, a reason why we have lost the traditional ancestral pillars, right? Or shall we say certainties. Well, why have we lost them? That question points to some further standard. What is the standard by which we can judge the ancient and see why the ancestral standards or certainties have been lost. Had they been really 100% solid, we would not have lost them. Had there been nothing wrong with them, nothing at all, had they been absolutely impeccable, immaculate, we would not have lost them. They would have saved us from evil, but they did not. So we lost them, and now we seek to understand why. What was not absolutely impeccable about those ancestral standards? And this is where the question of natural right comes out. What is right in itself? What was intended originally? And what is ultimately mean by right? So the recovery of the ancestral requires a standard. This we find out. But the standard is a question mark. As a question mark, it involves a kind of disclosure. It pertains to a source. A question mark is an opening, involves an opening to answers. Answers are welcome. So, we have here the Socratic question par excellence. What is the thing itself? And this, of course, brings this to mind, well, in Socrates' case, the question of the divine in itself. Right? So in Latin terms, the natura deorum, the nature of the gods. So we speak about gods, we speak about divinity. What is the nature? Instead of having battles between gods, we should ask about the nature of what is meant, right? What is ultimately meant, the nature of that which we're talking about. Now, with philosophy, however, if we consider the philosophical voice, so philosophy as it understands itself, the philosophical impulse, we don't see the source here of a crisis, but the exposure of a problem. There is something that is not altogether acceptable in the order of things for the philosopher. We could say that the philosopher has an inkling into the ignorance of people, but also, for taking this further, into the condition of people. People are as in a dream. It's as if people were sleeping and dreaming. And the philosopher exposes problems inherent in the conventional order of things. It says, well, these problems are, if you scratch the surface, they're retraceable to a vaster problem. We don't know what we're doing. We find ourselves as if in a dream world. Right? Plato's cave comes to mind. One could also think of Prince Siddhartha looking at the world around him, the society around him, and he sees everybody sleeping, as if dreaming, and I need to wake up. Right. In the modern world, it just so happens, and this can be said parenthetically, there is a solution that is proposed to the, shall we say, the injustice, even the imposture that philosophy exposes. What does philosophy expose? Well, the fact that things are not supposed to be the way they are. The way they are is not, shall we say, rational. So, in the modern world, we have technology. Technology magnifies the problem exponentially in the act of resolving it, so to speak. But it magnifies the problem of imposture. So the problem that has been produced by philosophy in the eyes of non-philosophers, it magnifies it exponentially to the point where appearance is, well, the new normal or the new real. Appearance becomes reality. Philosophers had tried to, well, they had pointed to a reality beyond appearances. But philosophy makes it exceedingly difficult to live by renouncing appearances and seeking truth itself or reality beyond appearances. Philosophy makes it exceedingly difficult to live. So the alienation that it tends to produce between reality and appearances leads people to seek to embellish appearances further. And so to pretend that appearances are real. And this is what technology ultimately offers. It offers us the possibility of living without truth, without reality. So it gives us a virtual reality. Appearance is the new reality. And this is possible through technology. This was not possible in earlier ages. Nobody really tried to do this systematically, to establish a society or world in which appearances could be the new reality. One could try to reestablish a pre-philosophical condition, or simply live out a war between parties, and each one represented the truth more than the other in its own eyes. Now, this kind of tribal warfare could find some imperial provisional resolutions, some Pax Romana here and there, but war kept going on, and struggles in the face of the philosophical challenge remained. So this tension between appearance and reality is some constant of sorts that we face throughout the centuries. And with the modern world, however, we have the rise of a solution, and this solution is a Machiavellian solution, which is incarnated by and realized in the technological society. Right. Well, but with this technological society, we have obscurantism. So we have the obscuring of nature, of the underlying, the hidden, which is denied, really, in practical terms, its being. And so we have the illusion of the autonomy of appearances. This autonomy is at first practical, but progressively it becomes the autonomy of the practical from any further consideration, metaphysical consideration. And there is, at the same time, growing indifference to the underlying. So there's no more asking why, the reason why, the underlying ontological ground of experience, this is all out of the window. Now, philosophy, again, in its own eyes, right? Philosophy in itself exposes something that is already there. That something is the compulsive element of ordinary life. People move in the element of reflexes for the most part, not rationally or in the element of reflection. Now, this is somewhat difficult for us to perceive, properly because of our modern upbringing. For modernity tries to replace reflex with reflection altogether. It tries to establish a society on the basis of reason. So it tries to establish the rational society. And yet the result is the inverse of what is nominally proposed. What we have today is not a society of reflection, most evidently, but one of reflexes. We react, knee-jerk reactions. We have no time and no patience for reflection. We have to move on quickly in discourse, in deed. We need to be quick, and we have a very short attention span. And yet, modernity opens up as a theatrical scene with this attempt to replace the compulsive life with a life of reason. Is this what modernity achieves? Well, that's clearly not the case. What is involved in the promise? Well, the irony here is that in order to establish a rational society, we must compel people to enter into it. And so the foundation for the rational society of reflection, is a reaction. So there is a non-rational foundation of compulsion for the rational society. We could say that in the modern world, the free or rational is rooted in unfreedom or compulsion. So it looks like we cannot change the impulsive nature to reduce, we could say, the past and the future to the present, to seek immediate satisfaction. This is what St. Augustine called the libido dominandi, this compulsion to dominate, to seek a resolution, a closure. And this is what philosophy sees as a problem in ordinary pre-philosophical life. People live in the present as if the present had no past and future. They don't question the present in any significant, fundamental way. And of course, philosophy asks about, well, the nature of the present. So the present turns out to be a question mark. And for this to happen, of course, the present has to be opened up, yeah? And when you open up the present, you split the past and the future. And so Now, this brings up the problem of genesis. What is the genesis of the present? And so, how is it that we get here? And so there are all kinds of complicated problems. Once you expose the genesis or the problem of the genesis of the present, you problematize, because the present becomes a problem that is no longer easy to accept face value. Now, a solid objection to philosophy here, to what philosophy achieves in practical terms, the effect of philosophy, is going to highlight the need for law, for standards. And if the problem of standards is reduced to genesis, so a genealogical problem, then we are lost as a society. We fail to account for what is present. The past and the future fail to account for the present. Why is it that we have this disclosure, this opening, this present, this gift, literally, right? Present. So we need an account that is not merely materialistic or genetic, or genealogical. We need to refer to essences. And this is what, of course, the Platonic tradition, the Aristotelian component being integral to it, emphasizes. Technology in the modern world gets rid of this tradition. It obscures it. So it's very difficult for us to appreciate it. And how does it do it? It does this by eternalizing the present, by establishing the present in its autonomy. It says, well, there's a genesis, sure, but this genesis now converges into an autonomous present. So there is the reduction of the past and the future to the present. The present becomes a solution to the problem of time. How can the present be, however, a solution and no longer a question mark? This is, of course, thanks to the machine. Now, the present is no longer a question mark, it is no longer a problem, and therefore, there is no more problem or question of death. Nobody asks about the meaning of death. Once we accept that the present is an answer to the genetic context. Now, the present, thanks to technology, endures. It endures how? In mechanical reproduction. So there's a stream of compulsion. The present we proclaim and acclaim as freedom. And so freedom is safeguarded by being contained and supported by a compulsive impulse, a drive. And this compulsion is what technology provides. And it wards off death. It saves the present from death, from being exposed as a question, as a problem, to the problem of, well, to the context of genetics, of genesis, of a genetic reduction. the past and the future are no longer challenging the present, but they're being used to support the present. They're being used by, or technologically, shall we say. Now, what this means is that we have an affirmation of the present through technology, and this carries with it a drive to feeling that is progressively intense. So technology carries with it this tendency to seek intensity of feeling. So feeling is channeled and fueled by the machine. This intensity grows until it reaches an extreme condition. And that is where it must inevitably explode. So there's a conflagration of intensity. So we could speak of madness as the result of, in fact, suicidal, as a result of this affirmation of the present. So the affirmation of the present carries with it the destruction, the seeds at any rate, of the destruction, the self-destruction of the present. We affirm the present. We affirm ourselves as present, our being present, as we explode. We have gathered the genetic, so our past and our future, into the present, this present that has been technologically constituted, essentially, is and manifests itself, in fact, as a tomb, a cage, and now we seek liberation from it. We just explode out of it. It is the intensity of the present, which is the autonomy of the present. So it is intense in the respect that it becomes a system in which past and future are engulfed, are brought together into a unity. This present is no longer sustainable. It has to explode. Its intensity points to an explosion. But now, there are two related problems with philosophy. Philosophy does not want to expose the compulsive too much. Why? If it does so, then it overshadows the pristine. It becomes counterproductive. It leads to cynicism, loss of what the Romans called pietas, devotion, honor, respect of authorities, and of authority as such. Philosophy seeks reality beyond sheer appearances, not as fundamentally, not as something to escape into, at any rate, not Platonic philosophy, not philosophy ever since Socrates, shall we say. Philosophy in the Socratic tradition. That philosophy sees that we are not entirely broken or corrupt. It is a philosophy that seeks to redeem common sense. Not destroy it. Not say, well, everything about the imagination, about common sense, is broken. And so we have to abandon all appearances and become cynics. All that Socratic philosophy tells us is that our natural reason needs a civil supplement to strengthen it, not to replace it. But at the same time, it shows that civil reason, reason of state, necessarily retains a natural component. So the conventional order of things is not altogether corrupt, and at the same time, our natural reason calls for it. Why? Why are both needed? Well, both are needed because of the weakness of man in the present condition. So the present is not acceptable. There is an origin that we are to return to, or that we are to, in the light of which we are to live the present as a problem. The present is a problem, never an answer. Now, because of this, we need both natural reason. So we could say that the reason of Adam, the original reason, and civil reason, reason of state. And so we need an education. We need to be educated. We need to develop the consciousness of the need of both. And in our lives, both need to be in harmony. Civil and natural reason. And this harmony itself is open necessarily to a transcendent truth, something that is not merely present. So, by transcendent truth, what do we mean? We mean that we're open to this original, shall we say, reason that is presupposed by the split between natural and civil reason. Now, the problem here is that philosophy can lead to overexposure of the inadequacies of the present, and so to linguistic abstractions that go hand in hand with, in political terms, with kind of imperialistic democracy, a fake liberty that we find exemplified by Athens in the ancient world. So words are seen now as instrumental to power. The civil order is seen as a mask rather than as a mirror of truth. And again, the Romans were rightly skeptical of this Greek corruption of philosophical abstractions from Greece, as perhaps America should have been of German philosophy and of German corruption, German democracy, as it rapidly transformed into the tyranny, the Nazi regime. Now, a second problem that philosophy encounters is that of resentment against it. So philosophy not only is shy because of the problem that we've seen, the problem of overexposure of problems, of the fracture. It is shy because also, perhaps shall we say, in a derivative sense, because of resentment that it encounters from those who seek to cover up the inadequacies of the present. So in Christian terms, the fall. Right? We live in a fallen condition. And philosophy exposes that. And in exposing it, it gets people angry. And, they don't want to young people to face this problem. They want young people to accept without question the status quo, right? The order of things as it is. There's another life, there's an afterworld, another world, another reality, the world of the dead. That is fine. And our world can be a preface to another world. That is fine. But this order of things that we have here, the present, should not be fundamentally questioned. And philosophy, of course, questions it and so exposes itself to the ire of non-philosophers. As a result, philosophy tends to speak in a very careful, prudent manner. And these two problems that philosophy sees itself facing, suggests to us that, in fact, the establishment of a rational society is impossible. For philosophy to attempt to establish a rational society would be for it to unleash our libido dominandi, on the one hand, and it would be for it to invite persecution of real philosophy, as opposed to the use that philosophy can be made of to unleash our libido. So non-philosophers will be keen upon using philosophy as an instrument, as a means to boost their non-philosophical tendencies or even compulsions. Now, philosophy can, and certainly in the Platonic tradition does, expose what we can call the fall, and so the need for the true God. Now, the true God here is understood as providence, the providence of a mind as a queen of nature or over nature, that accounts for and provides for a return to a pre-fall condition, so an original condition, the original good. So if we have this rift between the original condition of man and the present condition, now we beg for a God that can help us get back. Platonic philosophy recognizes that it's impossible to get back from our present condition. There has to be a help from outside, from the origins, a help that lingers, that is still at work in our fallen condition. We're not entirely fallen. We're not entirely lost. So there's this golden thread that ties us to the original condition. And this golden thread deserves to be understood in terms of divine providence. So God is no longer a mask, no longer at war with other gods, but is an agency, a providential agency that brings us back to the original good. And of course, that agency is none other than um, an involvement of the good in our present life. Now, Christianity, of course, upholds this position against those who deny the true God by pursuing the present as being, shall we say, if not altogether cut off from the problems addressed by philosophy, at any rate, indifferent to them. So the present as power, and even accumulation of power. Now, sure, in the face of death, until we have technology, of course, that revolutionizes things so that power can be understood autonomously. It can unleash the compulsive element of the present and turn it into a virtue. Christianity is at once opposed to, this is in the traditional language, two poles, the Epicureans and the Stoics. What does this mean? Well, both are understood to live in the element of compulsion. The Epicureans, read by the Vulgate, by vulgar men, stand for and lead to hedonism, ultimately. The Stoics, again read by vulgar people, by non-philosophers, lead to a situation which we could call legalism. So over-reliance on, an ultimate reliance on the letter of the word. So in either case, we have tyranny, so the loss of genuine freedom. Now, let us take a step back to our present situation. So we have today a crisis. Shall we say, we have a crisis of disciplines. And these disciplines face this twofold crisis. On the one hand, they serve an authority that is questionable, and on the other hand, there is internal confusion within the discipline. Not only is one discipline that is inherently superior to another displaced in the society, but within itself, the discipline is torn apart by the impact that authorities have on it, right? Internal impact, so that the good cobbler, so to speak, will not be rewarded. The bad one will be. Now, this raises the question for the apprentice: is why am I mastering my discipline? What am I mastering it for? Especially when it is made use of by evil forces. This brings to the fore this problem of a rift between the civil order and Eden, paradise lost. In the current situation, in a society where, as was announced in the 19th century, God is dead, so that thread, that gold line that connects the present to our original condition, is obscured and rejected, there is a tendency to carry on disciplines to the extreme or beyond boundaries. There is no natural limitation to my discipline. We can explore new venues, new ways of expression, new possibilities, unthought of, unheard of possibilities. Well, this, of course, leads to some confusion, but ultimately not in the respect that the goal ultimately will be diversification. The goal will be intensification of that discipline and of the experiences that it fosters, the feelings even that it fosters, the impression that it has on an audience, for instance. So it becomes a showing, right? The impact that the art, the discipline has on the public is what becomes the ultimate criterion for its legitimization. The good painter is the one that shocks the most. The good musician is the one that impresses the most. The one that ultimately contributes to the present, the intensification of the present. But as seen, of course, this intensification builds up, right? It's a kind of pressure cooker, and ultimately explodes. It can no longer be contained. Now, this intensification will involve, by necessity, recourse to technology, and this in all disciplines. Technology is needed if God is dead. So everyone will be able to enjoy this technology or be able to use this technology, which will flatter every discipline by aiding it, by supporting it with its unprecedented powers. Of course, there's a price to pay. For one thing, there is a distraction from the master technology or the technocratic regime. Nobody's questioning that. So the discipline is flattered as it is blinded to the flatterer, the nature of the flatterer. Where is it leading me? It is being compelled to go somewhere, since it is not going there naturally. Technology is compelling our disciplines to pursue an end that they must ignore in order to pursue their, to enjoy their benefits. Now, at the same time, technology supports partisan extremism. What does this mean? There is a loss of holism. In older societies, one could say that God supports holism, the whole human being, the whole polity, the wholeness of integrity of action. How so? Well, the idea is that God restores, divine providence, the true God restores us, our lives, in the light of our original condition. There is no original, integral nature to look back to with the technocratic society. So what do? Technocratic society is based on the notion that there is an original fracture. The fracture is original. In other words, we're broken originally. And now we have to establish a unity based on that original fracture. We have to use the fracture, the brokenness of man, to establish this technocratic unity in diversity, unity founded in diversity. Diversity involves partisan extremism. So technology empowers every discipline to impose itself over and against others. So it leads disciplines, those, of course, advocating them, involved in them, practicing them, to be empowered in a kind of tribal warfare where partisanship is the foundation of unity. Partisan ends that are disclosed by technology replace God as proper end of natural reason. These ends replace God for the discipline. So let us say the painter is no longer painting for God, the musician are no longer composing for, playing for God. He is playing for the empowerment of his discipline. And yet, this empowerment is all, for all of these disciplines, is feeding into the empowerment of this technocratic regime. Right? That is the hidden, ignored master. The context of this productivity, the creativity that we are all involved in. So the context is obscured. And not accidentally, we speak of very often of joy. So these disciplines bring us joy, not happiness. If not, where we have a reduction of happiness to joy. So we speak about, oh, I'm happy now, meaning I'm joyful. And of course, 1 minute later, I may not be happy. This has nothing to do with happiness in the classical sense, where happiness is a firm state of being that coincides with an activity that is proper to our own nature. So happiness is a virtue, it's a freedom which is virtue, understood as a function of truth. Now, in the setup, the present moment is sustained by machine. And it stands in stark contrast with the constance and virtue, the strength of mind that is sustained by eternal being, the good spoken of in the classical Platonic tradition. So here we have an unequivocal rift between these two modes of life. On the one hand, we have moderation of mind and immoderation of body. This is what we find in modernity. And on the other, we have this classical lesson. Moderation in practical life that is sustained by immoderate thinking. In other words, thought that goes to the infinite perfection of being. So there is this line, this rational line that connects this present that we're living in to our original condition and to the good itself. So with modernity, we have a subversion, an entire subversion of the ancient classical lesson. Right, well, philosophy today as well questions the ends of disciplines. If the end is not one in which deed and word are coherent, if the authority we serve, is not really what it appears to be, then there is no harmony between the will of authorities and that of subjects. So the natural hierarchy of ends doesn't coincide with the public or civil hierarchy. So the society we work in is not one of virtue. So again, you have the cobbler who is virtuous, perhaps, but not the statesman. And this is a situation, incidentally, that is spelled out in the Julius Caesar by Shakespeare. So the end the disciplines serve is not the one they intend. What is the end that they intend? Well, the excellence of the discipline, the excellence by nature, not by recognition by corrupt authorities, right? Not one that is a function of the rewards that are given to bad cobblers, so to speak. Now, with this situation, we have a crisis, right? All of these disciplines, a violinist, an architect, you name it, recognize that there is an outer crisis. But this outer crisis exposes an element, the element of compulsion we've seen, that is already present in our ordinary life, right? Which is then a fallen condition. And this is where any decent human being exposes himself to this quest for a search for a pre-fall condition, right, of which Adam is a paradigm. And this is where philosophy comes into play, right? So questioning what moves the practitioner, the cobbler, let's say. What really moves him? This involves reasoning about the end that is being pursued, examining the discrepancy between the end and the mean. So wherever there's this discrepancy, we have a fallen condition. So there's a distance between the fallen condition, what Cicero once referred to as that of men rolling in the feces of Romulus, the fex Romuli, and a pre-fall condition. Philosophy here is not only a reminder, but a mode of conversion. This calls to mind a medieval mysticism with which man wants, or is said to want, what God wants. Fundamentally, man wants what God wants. Human freedom coincides with divine necessity. So, in order to be free, a man would have to give up, so to speak, die in that respect, but shed all compulsions, so illusions, power, success, appearances, and be one with the order of things. In the case of the painter, this would mean that the painter would be nature itself, but not fallen nature. He would present, however, what things are in themselves in the context of a fallen world. He would be a witness to a pre-fallen condition in a fallen world. So he could offer no more than signs of origins, refracted in the darkness of our fallen world. But in any case, he would be free in the respect that he would be, his actions would stem from, right, without objections, without resistance, from what he really is, the unfallen condition of man. This is what would be the foundation of the painter's work. So the musician, the cobbler himself, will constitute the presence of the divine in the world in that respect. There would be no compulsion to their work, so these people would be free men. But as free men, they must remain hidden. Hidden in the respect that the world will not recognize them as free, because they will be seen, in fact, as most likely as threats to the established order that involves the obscuring of that true God that connects us to an original condition, and indeed of that original condition to begin with, and the good itself, the idea of the good, as Plato calls it. So the honest man will live on a cross. Right? He will be a witness. He will witness what is hidden by way of returning to it. Give a testimony that is hated by the world in Christian terms. Yeah? Now, what this suggests, finally, is that philosophy does not seek knowledge in merely abstract terms, but it seeks the good itself. So, in the context of this return to the good, knowledge as an abstraction is not enough. As something separate from practical life is not enough. What is at stake is an exploration that involves both epistemic and ontological dimensions. Not merely a psychological enterprise here, but it involves the transformation of consciousness, of our being conscious, kind of metanoia, a conversion. So a path of transformation, of elevation, of maturing, of perfection, not merely of purgation, of shedding, but of restoration, where the whole life is dedicated to truth. And that is what integration is originally about. So nothing is left behind. No method, no system is relied upon, no separation of theory and practice. The present is fundamentally opened up and is lived as a question mark. The self, being this present, in the present, is converted into a question mark. It is at best a mask of this present question, this problem, which in turn is exposed to the presence of the origins in our world, the presence of the light in the dark.